welcome everyone to today's webinar. I hope everyone had a happy Halloween yesterday. There's nothing spookier than a cybersecurity incident. So to help your firm be prepared, today we're going to learn about tabletop exercises, what they are, how they can help your firm, best practices in conducting them, and a little bit about how to do them. We are fortunate to have two experts from the IAA Strategic Partner ACA Group. I'd like to introduce Mike Papacina and Paul Chappelle from ACA Aponics, which is the Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Risk Division of ACA Group. Mike serves as a team leader in providing cybersecurity risk assessments, vendor due diligence, drafting policies and procedures, staff training, and product development. And Paul is a client development leader and previously was a senior privacy and cyber consultant and has led many cybersecurity and privacy engagements. We encourage you to participate in the polling questions that we have planned for you. And as Nora said, to submit any questions you have. So with that, I'll turn things over to Mike to get us started. Mike.
Thank you, Laura. So thanks everybody for attending. Just want to echo that, we're hoping that folks really get a good understanding as to, what a tabletop exercise is and why it's really important in terms of preparing for incidents and incident, preparedness. I think we can go forward a slide. Great. So talk a little bit here about, breaches, some recent ones in 2022. The whole reason why we talk about incident response and tabletop exercise is because, there are so many breaches that happen across really all sectors and industries. And it's really important for folks, to be prepared and know how to respond to a breach. We just got off the heels of October Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And, one of the key things, that we tend to talk about during that month is really, understanding and learning how, folks can better prepare, and respond to incidents. If you take a look at breach statistics and, you see across the board, some of the major ones that occurred in 2022, upwards of 80% of organizations have had more than one breach. And if you think about that, that's a staggering, number. There's kind of a little bit of a cliche in cybersecurity, lingo that it's not a matter of if, just a matter of when a firm will have a breach and have to respond to an incident. So, I think that folks this day and age realize that it's not something that may happen. It's something that likely will happen, during the course of a company's existence, and being prepared, is important. You can see by the number, $4.3 million is the average cost of a data breach, right? And that's kind of all in terms of, losses, due to the breach, recovery from that breach, external party fees, et cetera. And, that's something, to keep in mind, not covering it today, but certainly thinking about cybersecurity insurance and the role it plays, within incident response, and preparedness is something that, folks on the call, should also think about. And, as you can see, close to 20% of breaches, right, are caused at a compromise at a business partner. So, you don't have to be the company or firm that's breached in order to have to respond to an incident. And I think that's something that's really important. When you take a look at some of these breaches that are here, whether it's Okta, or Shields Healthcare Group, a lot of what happened in terms of breach response, had to do with third parties or what we call a supply chain breach, right, that caused, individual, firms to respond. So you might not be the firm that is directly compromised, if you will, but if a business partner of yours is, and you use that business partner, you may wind up, very well having to go into an incident response, plan and mode. And that's why it's important to be prepared. All right. So if we can move on to the next slide, we're going to kick off the session, with a polling question. Paul?
I'm sorry. Have you ever been involved in a cyber incident response situation, either simulated exercise or real incident?
Now, given what we saw from a percentage-wise, I would suspect that a fair number of you, have been involved, or your company's been involved, with an incident. But it'd be interesting to see from the audience, what that response is.
And as we wait for those results, I think what you were talking about in the last slide, something that always resonated with me was the head of our pen testing team saying, it's a 99% likelihood that I'll be able to get in. It's more of a question of, what can we do or what can we access once we get into the environment.
Yeah, no, that's really good to know. In terms of doing pen testing and sort of, seeing how your firm could be breached, once a pen tester's in, there's a lot that they could look at to see how they can, get data, compromised information, or wreak havoc. So looking at the response over here, we see, it's an interesting breakdown over here. About half of the audience has either experienced an incident or been through a tabletop. The other half is not. So I guess, without further ado, why don't we, move forward, talk a little bit about, the whys and the whats and the hows of what a tabletop exercise is. And then, after that, we're going to go into a real, interactive mode and actually do a lightweight tabletop exercise. So, why do we want to conduct tabletop exercises? Well, it goes without saying that firms, have different types of plans that they need to respond to. Here we're talking specifically around cybersecurity tabletops, but I think, prior to this, folks have been around, have probably, been involved in some level of what we call business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, and have gone through testing of those plans. Okay, it certainly wasn't uncommon, in the industry, to make sure that firms can respond to a business continuity disaster or disaster recovery. Certainly, we've done that recently on the heels of COVID and figuring out how we respond to a crisis. But conducting tabletops, with respect to any of these types of events, can really train your organization and how to prepare for these types of crises. Okay, it's also important to uncover, I should say, flaws or gaps, whether that's across people or processes or technology, really understanding where your weak points are, can be important, because you can then, from these exercises, figure out where you need to invest, in terms of your response programs and your cyber programs. If there's, gaps in technology and infrastructure and cybersecurity tool sets, you could look at investing in those. If you realize that maybe your processes aren't really crisp, or the people that you have in place to respond to exercises, aren't well trained or don't know how to respond, you can sort of tweak your plan and those folks that are involved to, put yourself in best shape to be able to respond. It's definitely a good way to see how firms and your organization could respond to real world, types of situations. I think, many folks have been through, obviously, the COVID pandemic and have likely gone through other types of business continuity scenarios, whether it's blackout, hurricanes, and the like. But, certainly with respect to cyber, if you haven't gone through one, understanding how we would respond to one can, see how your organization, handles it. It also helps you really determine and hone in on roles and responsibilities. Talking to you all as chief compliance officers, there's definitely a role with respect to responding to an incident that you're going to need to, participate in, right? As a compliance officer, there are certain regulatory obligations that you're going to be on the hook for. So, one of the key responders to any incident, is a compliance officer. And, not just that, but also looking at your technology, information security officers, and basically C-level executives who should be assembled, and who should respond to an incident. You definitely want to look at practicing collaboration and fine-tuning communications. Often when we run through tabletop exercises, we realize, just how often the left hand doesn't necessarily frequently communicate with the right hand. So making sure that you get the muscle memory down and how best to communicate is important. And also making sure that, or learning how to critically think, right? When you're presented with a scenario, usually the scenarios, are uncovered with something, very bad happening, right? And how you could respond to that and make a decision and how to move forward, is important. So all of these things, are reasons why firms should conduct a tabletop exercise to test their plans.
Yeah, and just one thing to add in there, Mike, I think, that Mike Tyson quote comes to mind for me of everybody has a plan, so you get punched in the face. This is that simulated punch in the face. So you have your incident response plan, best laid plans, making sure that it's actually appropriate for the business and what you're going to plan to do. And these exercises are a great way to, have that exercise, but not really take any of the damage of the punch. So just kind of understanding what can be done and the best way to do it.
Yep. No, agreed. You're better off practicing before you get hit with something, first time, real world. So next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what a tabletop exercise is. If we could move forward one, talking, really broadly, there are many ways you can, look at incidents and simulate incidents. There are different levels, if you will. There's, what we call like a classroom setting where folks will come in and just kind of teach what a tabletop is. There's the traditional tabletop, which I'm going to dive into in a second. Sometimes firms, as they get more sophisticated, will run simulated drills, and really sophisticated firms might, set up, situations in like a parallel environment or almost like a laboratory setting. What we're really going to focus in on here is what we call a traditional tabletop exercise. And really what that is it's discussion based, and it's a role play on how an organization would respond, to a particular simulated incident. The key thing around that is that a facilitator, will teach and instruct and work with the participants. And, the key thing is that when you do a true classic tabletop, you have all the participants in terms of incident response together, cliche here, around the table. We all know that when something happens in the real world, not everybody that is needed to respond to that situation is going to find out about that situation at time zero. Usually what happens is something happens, it goes through a series of escalations before something is deemed an incident and everyone gets, around a room to figure out how to solve it. A traditional tabletop will actually get those folks in a room, have them assembled, and then start talking through the incident, from time zero. And the reason why that's really effective is it gets everyone involved on the incident response team, together to talk through how the response should happen from, if you will, that time zero, right? So it doesn't really put any single person on the hook to kind of kick off and start the incident and start to make decisions. Having that collaboration early on in an exercise, we've learned helps open up dialogue and, also helps folks get comfortable with responding to an incident so they realize that they're not going it alone, that there's a team, working with them. Responses as exercises are unfolded, are vetted. And that's the other good thing about having everyone around the table when you're conducting these tabletops and simulations, is because it gives the opportunity for everyone that could be involved, whether it's tech, whether it's legal, whether it's operations, whoever's on your team, to, collaborate and think through, how the team wants to respond. Typically the facilitator will provide feedback along the way and also after the exercise. Often sometimes you conduct these, folks around the table may get stuck at a certain point. So having a facilitator there to nudge or plant a seed on what direction to go in is useful to keep the conversation, and dialogue going. One thing that we've learned, the most successful tabletop exercises are ones in which the participants live the moment and play along as if the scenario is actually happening. And, the reason why we talk about that being effective is, I always like to say when I conduct the tabletop, think about it, like the room is on fire, right? And the room is on fire and I'm either climbing out the window, right? Or I'm going through the door or I'm grabbing a fire extinguisher. It's not if the room were on fire, if I were near the fire extinguisher, I might try doing that. And the reason why we like to, make people kind of speak in the first person and live the moment is because it does sort of up the criticality of the situation, right? It's very easy if you start saying, if this were to happen, I would do this. It kind of lets you distance yourself. But a really effective tabletop, folks will live the moment, right? And actually go through the scenario as if it's actually happening, because that way, the decisions that are made, it will have consequence, right? And I think it's important that folks understand that when they go through a tabletop. The other thing too, and we'll get to this and I'll bring it up here, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer as situations unfold. And I think the key thing about tabletop exercises is that, when they're conducted, the exercises shouldn't be used to scold folks. They should really be used as a learning experience, to understand, how improvements can be made and how folks can, best collaborate.
Yeah, and I just echo those last 2 points, Mike, of living in that moment and that discussion really yielding the best results coming out of these exercises as I've conducted them with you or solo across the client base.
No, great. Thanks for that, Paul. And Paul, certainly feel free to chime in as I go through the next slide. I think it's worth talking a little bit about, what are the biggest gaps, that we see with respect to a tabletop exercise, and what can maybe deter from the experience. Look, folks go through tabletop exercises. A lot of times participants are doing it maybe to check a box, maybe to say that they've completed one, but they're not really engaged fully. And when that happens, really for all parties, the facilitated participants, if folks aren't fully engaged or don't believe in the cause, the outcome of the tabletop, normally isn't very, effective, right? And lessons learned aren't necessarily absorbed. So it's really important, that folks are bought into the exercise. And, buy-in doesn't just mean I'm going to show up to a calendar invite, but buy-in also means really, preparing yourself, for the exercise. What does it mean to be prepared for a tabletop? Well, number one, when you're testing against a particular plan, right, understand what that plan is and read through it. Bring your plan with you to a tabletop exercise so you sort of have your playbook, in front of you. Be active and participate. If I could tell you the amount of times I've conducted a tabletop where certain individuals that were key members of a response team, are distracted or don't respond, that says a lot. Like, how would that person really, step up in the event of a real incident? So participating actively, is important too. Some of the things that we've seen too, this falls less around the compliance folks, but defensive tech and security teams. We'll do a tabletop exercise. We'll bring up, a technical incident, and a lot of times the response we get from tech folks is why it couldn't have happened or what's in place to prevent it from happening. But the key thing about a tabletop is, folks, it's happening, right? If you look at some of the major breaches that we've seen in the supply chain, going back to SolarWinds or Kaseya, as well as the Log4j, these software components that were exploited. No one in a million years thought that these different, providers or, open source tools would get exploited, and folks had to respond. So it's important not to be defensive and to, live the moment. Lack of cohesion, right, across the different participants, right? And this goes across whether it's tech, ops, legal, compliance, anyone that's around the table, not really communicating properly, right? So, making sure that folks, understand who they're working with and they have that open lines of communication. Often we see that no one is running point on the tabletop, and, you don't have to be in charge to run point as much as you need someone that's sort of, taking notes, right? Understanding what the next steps are, what questions to ask, making the calls to different parties, whatever needs to be done. There really should be someone managing that incident. And it's important to simulate that, because when something happens in the real world, you want someone that's going to be able to step in and sort of guide everyone and bring them all together. Again, they don't need to be the chief decision maker. They just need to be organized and sort of quarterback the incident. And, I mentioned earlier, not being prepared, not leveraging your existing documented plans. Hopefully everyone on this call has at least a business continuity plan. I'm hoping most folks on this call, if not all, have some level of incident response plan, understanding what those plans say and what the steps are and what you should follow is important. Another kind of cliche quote was, I think it was Eisenhower, it's not the plan itself, but the act of planning that gets folks, through a battle, right? It's sort of the same thing, right? You may not follow your plan to the T, but if you're familiar with it and understand it, you'll be able to hopefully better respond to what comes your way. I don't know, Paul,
Yeah.
anything else you want to opine on there?
Yeah, just to piggyback on that one, whether leading or playing the secondary role in some of these facilitator exercises, looking around the table and seeing, does everybody in the room have the IRP, or that quarterback at least have the IRP to be able to, kind of run everybody through the roles and responsibilities that they're going to play, what's been documented, how we think we're going to approach this, is the first thing that we're looking through on our side. And then, making sure that if it's not, that we address that and kind of bring that awareness to the group.
Yep. No, I think that's great. And then, when you think about, the biggest gaps and, what we've seen and, what we're doing and why we're doing it, I think it's important to really understand, what are the outcomes, and we can move to the next slide, but what are the things that all parties, want to get out of a tabletop exercise? I think the number one, piece that you want, the number one outcome is what I would call executive buy-in. Okay. All you folks, the chief compliance officers, or directors of compliance are pretty senior in your firms, if not part of your C-suite. It's really making sure that your executive, right, your board, founders, managing partners of your firms, buy in to having an incident response plan and the testing of it, and making sure that the firm is well protected. Certainly developing a feedback loop is a key outcome, right? Every time you run through a tabletop exercise, and honestly, you could run through the same scenario multiple times, you'll always find, right, different feedback, different information, right? Maybe your plans matured, maybe the type of incident, tool sets have been improved, different people, to the table, but developing that feedback loop around the people, processes, and technology, okay? And with that feedback loop can help you then close those gaps, right? You might have policies and procedures, scenarios documented, as, attacks get more sophisticated. Maybe you see different types of incidents that need to be responded to. You always want to evolve those policies and procedures. So these tabletop exercises can really, provide that feedback and provide, takeaways that you can build back into your documentation. I spoke about, cyber insurance. When you look at the cost of a breach, more and more firms now are looking to, engage with a provider and have that cyber insurance to cover the cost of a breach. Whether it's a direct cost in terms of, equipment maybe that gets locked up or frozen, or, I would say indirect cost or softer costs of bringing in different third parties that you might need, to respond to an incident, whether it's a forensics firm, legal, public relations, all of those are typically covered, under insurance policies. Understanding, the different business units and the collaboration and the communications, knowing how you could communicate in an incident. It's amazing how many times, you talk about incident response plans. If key systems are taken down, how does your team communicate, right? If you've got, ransomware in an environment and your systems are locked up, you might not be able to communicate through those systems. So do you have alternate means to communicate, and how do you collaborate in the situation? Putting in place playbooks, right? So in addition to having plans on what to do, maybe you go through certain exercises that are very specific, and you start putting in place, steps for ransomware, steps for business email compromise, another type of attack, baby steps for a distributed denial of service, right? And as you test maybe some of these, scenarios, you and your IT team might be able to put in some really detailed playbooks, on how to respond. Looking at what tool sets that could help mitigate a scenario. Certainly firms that get hit with ransomware will implement different tool sets and different, methodologies to mitigate against ransomware. Certainly shoring up backups is a key one that firms that get hit, will do as a takeaway as well. And you can learn those lessons, through a simulation. As well as, here's a big one here is inclusion and modification of key third-party contacts. Often when we look at, folks that go through incident response, they talk about they're bringing in, their law firm. They talk about a PR firm. They talk about, having a forensics firm, right? But, do they have law enforcement as contacts? What if it's a major service provider, that's providing, services to your investors, if it's a fund administrator, right, managed service provider, do you have key contacts there to loop them in, should there be an incident? They might be the, the cause of that incident, right? And knowing who the key players are, your third parties are important. And often, you continue to build your Rolodex and contact information. So, those aren't all the outcomes of a tabletop, but those are some of the key ones, that can really give food for thought on how you as, individuals can, enhance the experience and build out your plans and responses.
Yeah, I think the one to echo on there is that first point. I think everything that you touched on there, Mike, is really important. I think on the backside too, these exercises can really help to generate some of that buy-in. So, as you mentioned up front, and how we generally see these run, or how we run these exercises, one of those recommendations is to get as many executives, and members of that C-suite, executive leadership teams to sit in on this exercise, whether they're playing an active role or just be able to be a participant and kind of observer to see what goes into this, see what, one of these incidents actually looks like in a mock simulation. And a lot of times that's pretty eye-opening on, hey, our IT provider covers all of that, or that's covered by internal IT. Nothing really to worry about there. As there's active participation, it sees what goes into this and is able to update those that buy-in and that awareness to make sure that it's being generated through these exercises.
Great. So I think without further ado, why don't we dive into a little truncated exercise. So before I kind of talk about the scene, I just want to kind of explain the format. So we're going to run through kind of abbreviated tabletop exercise with some key injects and simulation points that are typical of a tabletop. We're going to ask some polling questions, and we're encouraging everyone to respond. Everyone here that's in the audience should be thinking about themselves as the compliance officer of Equitax, and how you as an individual you as an individual as a compliance officer and part of an incident response team would respond to the scenario. Keep in mind that again, we say this is not a test, right? There's really no right or wrong answer. You'll see by some of the questions, your eyebrow will be raised, because you might say, what the choices that I have, they both look good or they both don't look so good. But either way, you're given some choices, and determining how you would proceed and why is really important. And Paul's going to play the role of the compliance officer, and he can sort of help through some of the whys. We definitely want to encourage folks to participate, and we're not doing this live in a boutique session where we can get folks in the audience to kind of respond real time. So I'm hoping that as we go through this, even with the polling questions, as we go through slides, please, ask some questions, right? Laura can help moderate and throw some questions out to us, as if you were, sitting on a tabletop, right? If you have some questions that you want to bring up around the particular, problem, that's presented to you as part of the scenario, definitely, let us know, and we'll do our best to, answer questions and walk it through. All right, so setting the table, Paul Chappelle over here, he's the CCO of Equitax, okay? You can see it's a firm with over 10,000 clients, including many high-profile celebrities. Equitax has offices in several locations across Europe and the United States. Equitax is a large financial services firm. You can see they offer accounting, payroll, tax planning, financial advice, to business clients and individuals. So you can see financial services offering a suite of services. You as a compliance officer are a member of the firm's cybersecurity incident response team, together with, head of IT, head of legal, financial officer, and head of client service. Okay, moving to the next slide. Right, we're going to go through a breach response simulation. So Tuesday, right, the head of IT, right, is sending an email to the senior management team advising that an IT vendor called Make It Easy has suffered a breach of their systems, and that data belonging to the vendor's clients has been exposed, right? They state that Equitax, who uses this vendor, data may have been included in this breach, okay? The breach was alerted by one of this IT provider's other clients. Make It Easy for the clients, after their data was found posted on paste sites. And what paste sites are is these are sites where often when breaches occur and the bad guys say, we're going to post that data publicly and make it available, this is one of those sites. So if you ever hear that as part of a response that the data was made available or posted, these paste sites are where that data could be posted and made available. At this point in time, you're not sure whether data belonging to Equitax was stolen or not. So take a second to think about that. That's the information, what you know at this point in time, right? A breach of the systems, that other clients of this provider, has been affected. There's evidence that other clients of this provider's information has been leaked, but really unsure, if your data has been affected at this time. And then moving on to the polling question, I think we have next. How would you respond? And we'll give it a minute here. It says polling questions not visible. So I'll read it out. I don't know, maybe Laura, if you can take a look.
I see it, Mike.
Yeah, you got it? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I got.
Okay, so it
Yes.
looks like there.
So it looks like from the people that were able to see the polling question, 95% went with B, and 5% went with A. You know, for me, you know, sitting in the CCO seat of this mock exercise, you know, I think one of the, like Mike mentioned, one of those, the most important things is the conversation. So I'm going to give that perspective from the CCO seat, you know, but ideally in one of these exercises, and like he asked, as people can, you know, chime in the chat or with questions, feel free to jump in and give perspective or ask questions. But you know, the first thing, you know, I want to do is I'm gonna probably more identify with B as we move into response A. So, you know, pull that incident response plan, be able to start working through it, reviewing what steps we should be taking right now and assessing whether we have an incident or a breach, or, you know, what scenarios might be coming into play and how we'd work through those, and what the impact's going to be on the back end as we get more information. So calling the team together, getting everybody in a room, starting to go through the IRP. And I think at this stage, a lot of that's going to relate back to getting information from Make IT Easy. So working with that head of IT to be able to understand, you know, what services are they truly providing us? You know, what access to data may they have? You know, do we understand, you know, what data they have, who has access to it, how they maintain access, to start evaluating, you know, what that impact may be. So, you know, if they're just providing help desk services to us, that might be a lesser impact than if they're truly managing our environment. So starting to evaluate what exposure is going to be there, how we can address that through our plan, and then working with the team to start trying to gather that information from Make IT Easy, and, you know, work with them and be as proactive as possible to be able to get that information as soon as possible, is going to help us, you know, progress through the this situation and determine what those next steps are going to be.
Yeah, and I think some other, you know, things to think about is, you know, knowing that it's an IT provider that's been compromised, you know, things like maybe your director of IT, you know, could be doing, right? You know, first of all, really kind of thinking through, is the vendor's kind of response, you know, acceptable now, right? Just kind of, you know, letting you know they're likely dealing with a bunch of inquiries across multiple clients, so they likely may not be responding, you know, as well as you'd like them to. But really starting to think about what are the key questions you want to ask them, you know, in terms of understanding whether or not your information that you've entrusted with them, you know, has been exposed. You know, other things that you may want to consider too is, you know, knowing that the provider that you're using, right, that manages, you know, your IT has had an issue, you know, how do you communicate? We sort of mentioned that earlier before, you know, in the prequel to this, but, you know, does the CSIRT continue to communicate over the systems that Make It Easy might be supporting? Do you look at other ways of communicating, you know, to make sure, you know, maybe you want to communicate out of band because you don't know if your communication channels, you know, could be potentially, you know, compromised, right? And then thinking through, you know, any immediate, you know, mitigation that you might want to put in place with respect to what systems or information you might want to, you know, think about not using, what you might, you know, instruct the firm and members of your firm to do or not do are also things that you'd want to, contemplate, as part of this. But I think, getting the team together and thinking these things through is a good, a good first step.
Yeah, and there's an interesting point in the chat about bringing a smaller team together to address the incident, because it may not be as easy to get everybody into a room if this is occurring in off hours or on a weekend. So I think that's a really good point of one of those points of consideration that's going to come up in a mock exercise of how are we going to address that. Things like GDPR's response, the proposed SEC, incident notification requirements, those 48, 72 hours of the point you become aware of a breach aren't just business hours. So how are we going to work if this is going to be a weekend or 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, to be able to take advantage of that full time frame that we have to be able to report, is definitely something that could come up in the exercise and might be one of those lessons learned coming out of the exercise of how to address something like that.
No, very good. And I think, to that point, if you can't get everyone and you may get a smaller team, you look to start with that. But, at this point, assembling key folks, could help move your way towards, addressing the incident. All right. So then kind of moving forward, that's sort of the first slide. So folks are assembled at this point. We can kind of go through the next, and this is what we call an inject in tabletop exercise speak. The next piece of information. So, all right, so what happens, now? So at this point, you have that information, folks are assembled, right? The head of IT, has convened a call to discuss the potential impact of the breach and next steps. So, whether that head of IT has got everybody or a subset, the first communications are in place. We can assume that a bridge line or something equivalent was open to get everyone, together on that. During that call, right, the head of IT advises everyone that make it easy, the provider has access to what we call a shared domain admin account, allowing access to data across the environment, including all client data. So, what a domain admin is, kind of think of it as a super user or a keys to the kingdom account. If the IT provider is supporting, your infrastructure, they're going to have super user accounts to have access to really, all information that's on your network. So that's just a piece of information that you're now made aware of, right? That the provider has access to this domain admin account, allowing access across the environment and, allowing access to where all client data could, potentially, be stored, right? So, before we go to the polling question, start to think about, what does your worst case look like now, right? In thinking this through, knowing that this level of account, right, has been compromised. Think about who else may need to be potentially brought in, at this point in time too. And from here, we can go to the polling question.
Yeah, so here, do you notify affected clients stating that their sensitive personal data may have been breached? Yes or no?
So something to think about, right? Knowing that the IT provider has access to all client data and has been confirmed that they've got super user access, what assumptions do you make now, and what decisions do you think about moving forward?
Yep. Yes, and so a question in the chat: how soon after are we still investigating? Here, I think this is about 45 minutes after the initial notification that Make IT Easy may have been breached. So definitely still in the investigation phase, of understanding, yes, they have access to domain admin, but what that may look like. So we have the responses here. It's about a 55% to 45% split. 55 saying yes, notify clients at this point, and 45 saying no, don't at this point.
Yeah, so I guess some
And
things
I
to
think-
think about. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, I think the next piece is another poll question. If we want to flip to that, and we can talk about some of the responses here.
Yeah, we can do that. We can cover both. That's fine. So similar when it goes to notifications, right? Do we notify your client base? And at this point, do you notify regulators?
Yep. So getting some good engagement here. I can see, another question or point of timing and means of contact should be discussed. I think, from my seat, I totally agree of talking about what we should be doing and how we're going to do it as we get more information. Another point of need to have a little bit more information at this point to make a decision, which is interesting. And then, discuss with legal before notifying and after confirming impact. So, here notify regulators is a 60-40 split. So 60% no, 40% yes. I think as we think about these, sitting in that CCO seat again, understanding that we have limited information. I think there are a couple points in the chat too of looking for more information, a little bit of ambiguity at this point. Within this exercise, that's really meant to be built in. So the ambiguity is meant to be built in here to determine how some of these decisions are going to be made. This is reflecting a relatively real life situation, especially when you're relying on a third party to provide information back. You're going to need to make some of these decisions, with some of this limited information, which might push out when a definitive decision is going to be made. So if I think about each of these questions here, I'm going to probably wait on any notification to clients or regulators. I would look to engage, our cyber insurance provider to be able to pull them in and utilize their resources that they may provide to us through the policy that we have with them. A lot of times, forensic firms are going to be a piece of your coverage who can help you work with Make IT Easy to get more information and to determine some of this information in more of a definitive nature. As to, when do we need to make notifications? How can we actually determine if our client data has been impacted in this situation? Because until we know that, there's limited impact in making any notifications. This might be, different environments or different pieces that, pull that into play.
Right. And I think what's interesting is, when you think about the responses like, I need more information before I make a decision, when you look at these scenarios, right, and, there are going to be points in time where a question may be asked and you may need more information, so at that point in time, then your answer would be no, right? Like if you're saying to yourself, do I want to do this now or need more information to do it? If the answer is I need more information, then, you would then respond, no, I'm not going to do it now at this point in time because I only know what I know. And, you may ask that question again, right? Do I notify clients? Do I notify regulators? Whatever those steps are, when more information, is uncovered, right? And that's, part of the whole thing in talking through the response, right? Like at what point in time during a breach scenario, do you decide to, go out and notify, et cetera. I think, one of the key things, that was brought up, and it was brought up in the chat around, invoking, cyber insurance. I think that's a great thing that folks have to think about, early on in the process, because, there are a couple of things about cyber insurance and breach and incident responses. You may have certain prescriptive ways of how you need to respond to an incident in order to have that coverage take effect. So notifying the insurance sooner than later, will help you kind of lay out, your response, right? Your response plan needs to be sort of melded, if you will, with your cyber insurance policy and requirements. So you know when it's time to engage in these third parties, right? You don't want to trigger necessarily forensics without triggering insurance, because there may be certain requirements that you need to meet and information you need from your insurance company to kick in forensics, right? One of the other things to think about too, with respect to these notifications is, are you making these notifications on your own as CCO, or do you bring in, outside counsel, right? Do you have privacy and cyber counsel either on retainer or available to you to, help you make these decisions, right? When you think about privacy regulation, and Paul can talk to this way better than me, right? Between GDPR and CCPA and all the other different states, if the records that could be affected are across multiple states and multiple jurisdictions, there's a lot of different requirements on who and what needs to be notified. Understanding that is important too. And then do you think about bringing in a PR firm at this time, right? Because if investor or client data is breached, even though it might happen at one of your providers, do you need to think about how you couch that and how you present that out, should you decide to notify investors or regulators, do you want a PR firm involved, to help with, if you will, damage control and make sure that your language and how you're crafting the responses, to these notifications are written appropriately, if you will. So those are some other things, to think through too.
Yep.
There's
Yeah,
a
and you
question
covered
here
one of the
about
pieces in the Q&A of having PR addressed in your IRP. I think, as well as you mentioned, Mike, outside counsel or inside counsel, whoever it may be that you're relying on to look at that from a PR and a legal point of view. There was an interesting piece in the chat here too. States, I think this really highlights the problems with the proposed cyber rule. And trying to think about how we should think about this in a real world situation. I think, just to bring this up now, I think, keep that in the back of your mind as we progress through the incident. Don't want to jump too far ahead here, but wanted to bring that up because I think that's a really good point, is thinking about how this comes into play and how some of those notification triggers may come into play. I think we can flip to the next slide.
Yep. Okay, so now you're here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, about 5-6 hours have gone by. Make it easy. They're still struggling. They don't have a clear sense of the extent of the breach. And they're all the questions that they're getting from not just you, but all their other clients is really slowing down their efforts to investigate, which is something that folks should keep in mind too, even if you have in-house IT, in terms of how easy it is for folks to share information while digging into actually problem solve. If you think about, vendor breaches and third parties, right? I just want to make a statement like that. That's kind of typical, right? There's only so much a vendor's going to reveal to you, and only so much they're going to be able to reveal, based on what they're doing themselves in order to contain, right? And put mitigating, potential mitigations in place, or responses.
Yeah, I think that relates directly back to our last two polling questions, or the initial polling questions of notification that you mentioned. Until you have definitive information, there's probably going to be a push to hold off on any notification. So that relates exactly back to your third parties and vendors, as well as they play a role in this.
Yeah. All right. So moving to the next slide. Now we kind of fast forward a day and keep in mind, artificialities of timelines when we do these scenarios, which is something I probably should have mentioned earlier. But, it turns out that, your CEO reports that you've received an email from evil ones at hackers.ru. That particular sender claims they have sensitive information and sensitive data related to your customers, clients, and employees. They say they're threatening to release the data unless a ransom of 500 Bitcoin is paid within 72 hours. You could do the math on Bitcoin, but that's pretty hefty ask. And the email includes a link to an onion, or what we call a dark web address, right, which shows a page, because we'll make an assumption that someone was able to access that, showing that there are client financial accounts and files related to payroll with sensitive HR matters. So now you've got what appears to be evidence of that information, being leaked, and available. So we can move to the polling questions, and I think we have 3, so we'll ask all of them and then we'll talk through them later. Right. So question here: as a CCO, do you advise Equifax to pay the ransom demand, I should say? And we'll give folks a few seconds there.
Yeah, and we have a couple polling questions here. So as we move into the next ones, I'll give my perspective on.
Yeah, I think that's probably
on this
good.
one. Yeah, so on this one here, we can flip to the next one. The response is 85% no, and 15% yes.
Right. And I think, maybe we move to the next polling question while we kind of talk through the last one. If you notify impacted clients at this point, now that you have evidence of those, that may have been affected, really good question about paying ransom. And, there are implications with respect to OFAC and, suspicious filing SARS reports, et cetera, for certain ransom payments, which can also influence a decision. But, obviously thinking that through, because in this particular case, we're not talking about necessarily getting data that's held hostage given back, but we're talking about whether or not the data that has already been stolen, gets released and made public. There is a saying that a lot of these cyber criminals that ask for ransom, are kind of honorable in the sense that if you pay them, they're not going to go against their word because they want their illegitimate accents legitimized to some extent. But the reality is, once that data is out there, you can pay a nickel, you can pay $1 million, but or more, but you still don't know where that data is going to live and where it's going to wind up. It could wind up still being revealed and compromised because it's already been published and maybe other threat actors have access to it. So, thinking through that's important. I think here, knowing now, and I think this is the more information that folks were looking at is, do we have definitive answer around the data being compromised? I think at this point is yes. So Paul, kind of your thoughts on that in terms of now being appropriate time to respond potentially, or at least thinking it through.
Yep. So a 93% yes here on notify impacted clients. Once you see a lot of this information related to your clients receiving that information, I think there needs to be strong consideration with counsel on those notifications to clients to get out in front of this. Again, I think PR needs to be engaged, outside counsel needs to be engaged. I think also law enforcement needs to be engaged at this point, especially in this case, looking at that email address, probably the FBI, local FBI office, to be able to bring them into play, and across those parties discussing how to approach this from a payment, and then with PR and legal counsel talking about notification. I don't think this is necessarily a question of if, but how. So what information are we going to provide? How are we going to provide it? What's that going to look like? To Mike's point, different requirements across different states. Different requirements here in the US versus the EU. So having a partner to be able to help manage what that looks like and how it's going to be done is going to be key here as well. And then, I think a number of different comments here on cyber insurance. If you have cyber insurance, again, having that outlined in the plan, what their stance is, how to be able to address that. Another polling question here on notifying them. But engaging them, definitely engaging their forensic experts at this point, if that hasn't been done to this point, and making sure that we can get as much information as possible. Engage the insurance provider of their advice on whether to pay or not, what coverage they'd provide within that, and really to start gathering as much information as possible and then executing on the plan that we've outlined with our partners like outside counsel, regulators, PR, law enforcement, to make sure that we have the best response possible here.
Yeah, and many times, like a cyber insurance policy will include a breach coach and forensics, and those folks can help find, resources, if you will, should you decide to pay the ransom, in terms of, is that ransom covered and how much under your policy? That's going to vary obviously from policy to policy, but those are all, discussion points that you would have with those parties, if you will, at this point in time. We certainly wouldn't recommend that, firms themselves just go out and pay the ransom on their own, without going through an intermediary and understanding what the insurance, implications are. Okay, so I know we're getting short on time. If you move on to the next slide, that would be great. So what happens, here we are next day, and again, artificialities in the timeline, but it turns out that hits the news, right? And that, not just, quote unquote, everyday folks are affected, but, they're definitely high profile people and TV stars, were impacted by this particular breach, right? So now that the attackers had the information, right? And that regardless of where you are in the process, that, it's been made known that, the information has been out there, right? And at this point in time, we don't have a follow-up polling question, but when we talked about engaging, PR, or when it's time to engage clients, if the thing you need to be aware of is, trying to stay ahead of any kind of news or any kind of, public information that could potentially bring, bad, reputation or, reputation damage to the firm. So, clearly thinking through communication plans and having PR firms and folks that can help you through, this kind of, situation is important. And if they weren't already contacted, at this point in time, certainly, they would be now. And, typically insurance policies, will have some coverage on, bringing in, PR firms, right? And at this point, you might think about, obviously the, communications to clients and your staff, but do you think about credit monitoring, and at this point, if it's public, that the information has been breached, if regulators haven't been notified, now might be the time to do so. I wanted to address a question before we wrap up and hit takeaways, because someone brought up about the new SEC rule and that 48-hour notification window being very narrow, with a breach. And the only thing I can say there is, echoing those concerns. I think that the rule, if it comes to fruition, I know that there was a lot of feedback in the comment period about 48 hours not being enough time. Most regulation like GDPR and federal guidelines is typically 72. SEC for public companies is 96. So hopefully they, relax that requirement and extend the timeline. The other thing too is, there's no specifics as to what needs to be confirmed when it's reported. So, use your judgment there should that rule come into fruition. And I'm confident Aponics will have guidelines around this when the rule is, is cemented. But, in terms of how you will, and what you should be saying, it's less about saying you have to notify with excruciating detail and more to say that, we need to notify the regulators that there's something potentially going on and, updating, right, as more information, becomes available. So just keep that in mind. If we go on to the next slide, as we look to wrap up, I know we're running a little over, so we'll try to go quickly here. I think what are the key takeaways, right? Obviously, making sure you have an incident response plan, assuming likely you'll experience a breach. You want to test the plan and train. I think it's important to realize, as you think about yourselves here, that the response team should include senior staff across these various functions. When it comes to talking to investors and clients and all that, that your head of investor relations would be involved, that you make sure that those folks are part of your, plan now. Certainly incident response isn't something you outsource to IT service providers. You need to have your own plans and how you respond. You certainly can't rely on a third party's response plan to be yours, if you will. And, looking at service providers, and we mentioned a whole bunch that can assist in the event of an issue, from legal to forensics, to PR firms and, even intermediaries to help pay ransom, should you need to do that. Okay, and then I think moving on to our last slide, in terms of, that's it. I guess it looks like we're at the end. Well, thank you very much then. I shall close with, I know we had an hour. It looks like we just got to the top of the hour. If there's any, questions, I can stay on the line a bit. I know your calendars like Laura, I can stay on the line for a moment, or if not, I'm going to thank everyone for their time, and, thanks for having us. And hopefully you found this informational, and, gave you folks food for thought on how to respond to an incident and why tabletops are important.
Yes, thank you so much to Mike Papacina and Paul Chappelle from ACA for this excellent run through. Some of these questions were really hard to answer because you don't feel like you have all the information, and that's real life. You don't have everything all at once. So I think this is a really realistic introduction to tabletop exercises. I hope everyone tries this at their own firms and encourages everyone to live the moment. I love how you put that, and really treat it seriously, because that's the best way to prepare for the real thing. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.